The phone call that would destroy my life came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly financial reports at my accounting firm. My wife Jennifer's voice crackled through the speaker, unusually animated for 10:30 on a weekday. "David, you'll never believe what just happened," she said, practically bouncing through the phone. "My cousin Bradley just called. He's getting married next month and he wants us to help plan the reception. Isn't that exciting?" I set down my coffee mug and rubbed my temples. Bradley Morrison was Jennifer's 28-year-old cousin who had never held a job for longer than 6 months and still lived in his parents' basement. The idea of him getting married seemed about as likely as me winning the lottery, but stranger things had happened. "That's great, honey," I said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice. "Who's the lucky girl?" "Her name is Madison, and apparently she comes from a very wealthy family. Bradley says her parents are willing to pay for everything, but he wants us to coordinate with the vendors and handle all the logistics. He specifically asked for you to manage the financial side of things." Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. A red flag immediately went up in my mind. Bradley asking me to handle finances was like asking a vegetarian to manage a steakhouse. We'd never gotten along particularly well, mainly because I'd always been vocal about his lack of ambition and his tendency to mooch off his parents. Jennifer, however, had always defended him, claiming he just needed time to find his path in life. "Did he say why he wants me involved?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "He says he trusts your business expertise, and since you're family, he knows you'll make sure everything goes perfectly. Plus, Madison's parents are very particular about having professional oversight of their investment." I could practically hear the dollar signs in Bradley's voice through Jennifer's retelling. This whole situation had the distinct aroma of trouble brewing, but I also knew that saying no would create tension between Jennifer and me. Her family meant everything to her, even the problematic members like Bradley. "All right," I said finally. "Set up a meeting with him this weekend. I'll want to go over all the details and understand exactly what we're committing to." "Oh, David, thank you so much. This means the world to me. Bradley is so excited to have us involved. He's coming over Saturday afternoon to discuss everything." After hanging up, I stared at the financial reports on my desk, but the numbers seemed to blur together. Something about this whole arrangement felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Maybe it was just my natural skepticism when it came to Bradley's schemes. Or maybe it was genuine intuition warning me to stay away. Saturday afternoon arrived with unseasonable warmth for October. Jennifer had spent the morning cleaning our already spotless house and preparing an elaborate spread of appetizers that could have fed a small army. When the doorbell rang at precisely 2 o'clock, she practically sprinted to answer it. Bradley Morrison stood on our doorstep, looking like he'd stepped out of a men's fashion magazine, which immediately struck me as odd, considering his usual wardrobe consisted of wrinkled t-shirts and jeans with holes in them. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his shoes looked expensive, and he wore a confident smile that I'd never seen on his face before. "David, Jennifer, thank you so much for agreeing to help with this," he said, embracing Jennifer warmly before extending his hand to me. His grip was firmer than I remembered, and his entire demeanor seemed different somehow. We settled in the living room, and Bradley launched into his presentation with the enthusiasm of a seasoned salesman. Madison's family, he explained, owned a chain of successful restaurants throughout the Midwest. They were willing to spend upwards of $200,000 on the wedding reception, but they insisted on having local coordinators to handle the day-to-day logistics. "The thing is," Bradley continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, "Madison's parents are very particular about who they work with. They've had bad experiences with wedding planners in the past, so they prefer to work with family members of the bride and groom. That's where you two come in." Jennifer was practically glowing with excitement, but I found myself studying Bradley's face for any signs of deception. Everything he was saying sounded reasonable on the surface, but there was something theatrical about his presentation that made me uncomfortable. What exactly would our responsibilities be? I asked. Nothing too complicated, Bradley replied smoothly. You'd coordinate with the caterers, florists, musicians, and venue staff. Make sure all the payments are processed correctly and on time. Basically, be our representatives to make sure everything meets Madison's family's standards. And what's our compensation for this work? I pressed. Bradley's smile faltered slightly. Well, it's family, you know. Madison's parents are covering all expenses, including a generous budget for coordination fees. Plus, you'd be helping us start our marriage off on the right foot. There it was, the catch I'd been waiting for. Bradley expected us to work for free while handling a six-figure budget for people we'd never met. I glanced at Jennifer, who was still beaming with excitement, and realized this conversation was going to be more complicated than I'd anticipated. Bradley, I said carefully, coordinating an event of this magnitude is essentially a full-time job for several weeks. If Madison's parents have budgeted for coordination fees, then there should be compensation involved. His expression darkened slightly, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of the old Bradley underneath the polished exterior. I thought family meant something to you, David. This is my wedding we're talking about, not some business transaction. Of course family means something to me, I replied, feeling my own temper starting to rise. But you're asking us to take on significant responsibility and liability. What happens if something goes wrong? What if a vendor doesn't deliver as promised, or there's a problem with the budget? Nothing will go wrong, Bradley said dismissively. Madison's parents have connections with all the best vendors in the city. This is going to be a smooth, professional operation. Jennifer finally spoke up, her voice slightly strained. David, maybe we could just help out this once. It would mean so much to Bradley and Madison. I looked at my wife, seeing the hope in her eyes, and felt my resolve weakening. This was clearly important to her, and I didn't want to be the villain who ruined her cousin's wedding plans. But every instinct I had was screaming at me to walk away from this situation. All right, I said finally, but I want everything in writing. Responsibilities, timelines, budget parameters, everything. And I want to meet Madison and her parents before we commit to anything. Bradley's smile returned, brighter than before. Absolutely. Madison is so excited to meet you both. Her parents are flying in next weekend and we can all have dinner together. You're going to love them. As we shook hands on the arrangement, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just agreed to something that would come back to haunt me. But Jennifer was so happy, and Bradley seemed genuinely grateful for our help. Maybe my skepticism was unfounded. Maybe this would actually be a positive experience that would bring our family closer together. Looking back now, I realized that moment marked the beginning of the end of life as I knew it. If I'd trusted my instincts and walked away from Bradley's proposal, everything that followed could have been avoided. But hindsight is always 20/20, and at the time, I thought I was making the right choice for my marriage and my family. The meeting with Madison and her parents was scheduled for the following Saturday at an upscale restaurant downtown. Jennifer spent the entire week planning her outfit and researching conversation topics, treating the dinner like a job interview. I, meanwhile, prepared a list of questions about the wedding logistics and tried to manage my expectations. The restaurant Bradley had chosen for our dinner meeting was the kind of place where entrees started at $40 and the wine list required a small loan to navigate. As Jennifer and I walked through the mahogany-paneled entrance, I couldn't help but wonder who was picking up the tab for this particular gathering. Bradley and Madison were already seated at a corner table, along with an older couple who I assumed were her parents. As we approached, I got my first look at the woman who had supposedly captured Bradley's heart and transformed him into this polished version of himself. Madison Chen was stunning in an understated way, with long black hair and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. She wore a simple but elegant dress that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, and her jewelry was the kind of subtle luxury that whispered rather than shouted about money. Her parents, Richard and Susan Chen, looked exactly like what I'd expected from Bradley's description. Richard was a distinguished man in his 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being in charge. Susan was petite and impeccably dressed, with the kind of ageless beauty that suggested regular spa treatments and expensive skincare. "David, Jennifer, I'd like you to meet my fiancée Madison and her parents," Bradley said, standing to make introductions. "This is my cousin Jennifer and her husband David, the ones I told you about." The handshakes were warm and friendly, and within minutes we were all seated and perusing menus that made my accountant's soul weep. Richard immediately took charge of the conversation, asking about my work and seeming genuinely interested in the challenges of running a small accounting firm. "Bradley tells us you have extensive experience with event planning and vendor management," Susan said, her voice carrying just a hint of an accent that suggested expensive education rather than foreign birth. I glanced at Bradley, wondering exactly what he'd told them about my qualifications. "I've handled some corporate events and fundraisers through my business, but nothing on the scale of what you're planning for the wedding." "Oh, don't be so modest," Madison interjected with a smile that seemed genuine. "Bradley says you're incredibly organized and detail-oriented. Those are exactly the qualities we need for someone to coordinate with our vendors." As the evening progressed, I found myself genuinely liking Madison and her parents. They were warm, intelligent people who clearly adored their daughter and wanted her wedding to be perfect. Richard regaled us with stories from the restaurant business, while Susan shared her vision for the reception decor with infectious enthusiasm. The red flags didn't start appearing until we got down to the actual logistics of the coordination work. When I asked about the specific budget parameters, Richard waved his hand dismissively. "Don't worry about the money, David. We want the best of everything, and we're prepared to pay for it. Your job is just to make sure our vision becomes reality." "I understand that," I replied, "but I'd feel more comfortable with some general guidelines. Are we talking about a budget of $50,000, $100,000, or more?" Bradley jumped in before Richard could answer. "Like I mentioned before, Madison's parents are planning to spend around $200,000 total. But they're very flexible if we need to adjust upward for the right vendors. $200,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. I'd handled budgets that large for corporate clients, but never for a single event, and never with the kind of personal liability that seemed to be involved here. "That's a substantial amount," I said carefully. "What kind of oversight and approval process are you envisioning for major expenditures?" Susan and Richard exchanged a look that I couldn't quite interpret. "We trust your judgment completely," Susan said. "Bradley has told us so much about your business acumen. We're confident that you'll make decisions that align with our vision." The conversation continued for another hour, covering details about the venue, catering preferences, and timeline. Everything sounded reasonable and well-planned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there were important details being left unsaid. The Chens seemed almost too trusting, too willing to hand over control of their daughter's wedding to people they'd just met. As we were preparing to leave, Richard pulled me aside while the others were saying their goodbyes. "David, I want you to know how much this means to us," he said, his voice sincere. "Madison has been through some difficult relationships in the past, and Bradley has been wonderful for her. We want their wedding to be absolutely perfect, and having family involved gives us tremendous peace of mind." His words seemed genuine, and I felt some of my skepticism melting away. Maybe I'd been overthinking the situation. Maybe this really was just a generous family wanting to ensure their daughter's happiness. The drive home was filled with Jennifer's excited chatter about the evening. She'd clearly been charmed by the Chens and was already making mental lists of tasks and timelines. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and by the time we pulled into our driveway, I was actually looking forward to the challenge of coordinating such an elaborate event. "They seem like wonderful people," Jennifer said as we got ready for bed. And Madison is perfect for Bradley. Did you see how happy he looked tonight? I had noticed that Bradley seemed more relaxed and confident than I'd ever seen him. Maybe getting engaged had given him the motivation he'd been lacking all these years. Maybe this wedding would be the fresh start he needed to finally become a responsible adult. They do seem nice, I agreed, but I still want to get all the details in writing before we commit to anything. A project this size needs clear parameters and expectations. Jennifer nodded, though I could tell she thought I was being overly cautious. Of course, honey, whatever makes you comfortable. I'm just excited to be part of making their day special. Over the next few days, I threw myself into research mode, learning everything I could about high-end wedding coordination. I contacted several vendors to get a sense of pricing and availability, and I created detailed spreadsheets to track expenses and timelines. The more I learned, the more I realized what a massive undertaking we'd agreed to take on. The first real warning sign came when I tried to contact the Chens directly to discuss some budget questions. The phone number Bradley had given me went straight to voicemail, and my emails bounced back as undeliverable. When I mentioned this to Bradley, he seemed unconcerned. "Oh, they're traveling for business this week," he explained. "Madison handles most of the wedding communication anyway. Just coordinate everything through her." But when I tried to reach Madison, I got the same result. Voicemail and bounced emails. It was as if the entire Chen family had vanished into thin air immediately after our dinner meeting. I started to feel the familiar knot of anxiety forming in my stomach, the same feeling I got when a client's financial records didn't add up correctly. I decided to do some independent research on the Chen family and their restaurant business. What I found made the knot in my stomach tighten into a full-blown cramp. There was no record of a Richard Chen owning restaurant chains in the Midwest. No business licenses, no corporate filings, no mention in industry publications. It was as if the successful businessman I'd met didn't exist outside of that dinner conversation. My hands were shaking as I called Bradley's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried his parents' house, his usual hangouts, even his previous employers. No one had seen or heard from him in several days. It was like he'd disappeared along with his mysterious fiancée and her wealthy parents. The full scope of what had happened didn't hit me until I checked my business bank account online and saw that it had been completely emptied. $53,000 gone without a trace. Money that belonged to my clients. Money that I was personally responsible for. Money that I had no way to replace. My phone was ringing, but I couldn't bring myself to answer it. I knew it would be clients calling about their accounts, vendors demanding payment for services I'd never authorized, or worse yet, law enforcement agencies wanting to discuss the massive fraud that had been committed using my business credentials. Jennifer found me sitting at my desk an hour later, staring at the empty bank account screen with tears streaming down my face. When I finally managed to explain what had happened, she went white as a sheet and sank into the chair across from me. "There has to be some mistake," she whispered. "Bradley wouldn't do this to us. He's family." But even as she said the words, I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. The Bradley we'd known our entire lives was exactly the type of person who would pull a con like this if he thought he could get away with it. We'd just been too blind to see it coming. The next 72 hours were the worst of my life. The phone calls started before dawn on Tuesday morning, and they didn't stop until well past midnight. Clients demanding explanations for their missing funds, vendors threatening legal action over unpaid invoices, and my business insurance company informing me that my policy didn't cover losses due to criminal fraud. By Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in the office of criminal defense attorney Michael Stevens, trying to explain how I'd managed to lose $53,000 of other people's money to a con artist who happened to be my wife's cousin. Stevens was a sharp-eyed man in his 40s who specialized in white-collar crime, and he didn't seem particularly optimistic about my situation. "The problem, David, is that from the outside, this looks like an inside job," he explained. leaning back in his leather chair. You had access to the accounts, you authorized the transfers, and the beneficiary was a family member. The fact that you were also victimized doesn't change the legal liability you're facing. But I never authorized any transfers, I protested. Someone must have used my credentials fraudulently. Can you prove that? Do you have documentation showing that Bradley or his associates had access to your banking information? Any evidence that you were coerced or deceived into providing authorization? I thought about the dinner meeting, the smooth presentations, the way Bradley had seemed so different from his usual self. But none of that constituted proof of fraud. If anything, it made me look gullible and negligent for not conducting proper due diligence before getting involved. What are my options? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Honestly, your best bet is to cooperate fully with the investigation and hope the authorities can track down Bradley and recover the funds. In the meantime, you need to prepare for the possibility of criminal charges and civil lawsuits from your clients. I walked out of Stephen's office feeling like a dead man walking. My business was ruined, my reputation was destroyed, and I was facing the very real possibility of prison time for crimes I didn't commit. But the worst part was still to come. Jennifer was waiting for me in the car, her face streaked with tears and her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. The past few days had aged her visibly, and I could see the strain of the situation taking its toll on her health. "What did he say?" she asked as I buckled my seatbelt. "Nothing good. We need to prepare for this to get much worse before it gets better." The drive home was silent except for Jennifer's occasional sniffles. I stared out the window at the familiar neighborhoods we'd driven through thousands of times before, wondering if I'd be seeing them from the inside of a police car the next time. Our house felt like a tomb when we walked through the front door. The answering machine was blinking with 17 new messages, and I could see a stack of legal documents that had been slipped under the door while we were gone. I was about to start going through them when the doorbell rang. Standing on our front porch were Tom Harrison and Steve Martinez, two of my closest friends for the past 15 years. Tom was a fellow small business owner who ran a successful construction company, while Steve worked as a manager at the local bank where I'd done business for over a decade. Under normal circumstances, I would have been happy to see them. But the expressions on their faces told me this wasn't a social call. "David, we need to talk," Tom said, his voice cold and formal in a way I'd never heard before. I invited them in, and we settled in the living room where just 2 weeks earlier I'd agreed to help coordinate Bradley's wedding. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I didn't think my friends would appreciate the humor in the situation. "We heard about what happened with your business," Steve began, his banker's training evident in his careful choice of words. "Some of our mutual contacts have been asking questions about their dealings with you." "I'm sure they have," I replied. "But I hope you both know that I would never intentionally defraud anyone. This whole thing is a nightmare that I'm trying to wake up from." Tom leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "The thing is, David, this doesn't look like something that just happened to you. From what we're hearing, you were actively involved in setting up fake vendor accounts and authorizing transfers to shell companies. That's not the behavior of an innocent victim." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "Where are you hearing this? None of that is true." "Steve's bank flagged several suspicious transactions from your business account over the past month," Tom continued. "Payments to companies that don't exist, transfers to offshore accounts, the whole 9 yards, and apparently you were the one who authorized all of it." I looked at Steve, hoping to see some sign of support or understanding, but his face was a mask of professional neutrality. "I'm sorry, David, but the evidence is pretty damning. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit has already been in touch with our fraud department." "The FBI?" Jennifer gasped from the doorway, where she'd been listening to our conversation. "This is insane," I said, standing up and beginning to pace around the room. "I never authorized any transfers to shell companies or offshore accounts. Someone must have used my credentials without my knowledge. Come on, David, Tom said, his voice taking on an edge of anger. Do you really expect us to believe that you just happened to be the victim of an elaborate con job at the exact same time that your business was being used to launder money? That's one hell of a coincidence. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. These were men I'd known for 15 years, men whose children had played with our kids, men I'd trusted with my deepest secrets and fears. And they were looking at me like I was a common criminal. I expect you to know me well enough to realize that I would never do something like this, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I've been set up, and I need my friends to help me prove it. Steve shook his head slowly. I've seen a lot of financial crimes over the years, David. The people who commit them are usually the ones you'd least suspect. Respected community members, family men, people who seem to have everything going for them, but when the pressure builds up, they make desperate choices. What pressure? I demanded. My business was doing fine. Jennifer and I don't have any financial problems. There was no reason for me to risk everything on some stupid scheme. Maybe not financial pressure, Tom suggested, but everyone knows you've been struggling with Bradley's situation for years. Maybe you saw an opportunity to teach him a lesson, or maybe you thought you could skim a little off the top of his wedding budget without anyone noticing. The suggestion was so absurd that I almost laughed. You think I stole $50,000 to teach my wife's cousin a lesson? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Is it? Steve asked. Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you got involved in a high-dollar wedding coordination deal with people no one can verify exist, and then all the money disappeared. Either you're the unluckiest man alive, or you're not telling us the whole truth. I sank back into my chair, feeling the weight of their suspicion crushing down on me. These were intelligent, rational men who knew me well, and they were convinced of my guilt based on circumstantial evidence and their own assumptions about my character. If I couldn't convince my closest friends of my innocence, what chance did I have with a jury of strangers? I think you both need to leave, Jennifer said quietly from the doorway. Her voice was steady, but I could see the tears streaming down her face. Tom and Steve stood up, their expressions a mixture of disappointment and disgust. We're sorry it's come to this, David, Tom said. But we can't be associated with someone who's under investigation for financial crimes. It's bad for our businesses and our reputations. And if you're thinking about asking for character references or testimonials, Steve added, you should know that we won't be able to help you. Our lawyers have advised us to maintain distance until this situation is resolved. They left without another word, closing the door behind them with a finality that echoed through the house. Jennifer and I stood in the living room, staring at each other across a chasm that seemed to have opened up in the space of a single conversation. They think I did it, I said, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. I know, Jennifer replied, wrapping her arms around herself as if she were cold. And if they think that, everyone else will too. She was right, of course. Within days, the story would be all over town. David Morrison, respected accountant and family man, accused of embezzling client funds and laundering money through fake wedding vendors. The details would get exaggerated with each retelling, until I became the mastermind of an elaborate criminal enterprise, rather than the victim of a sophisticated con game. Our phones stopped ringing as friends and clients distanced themselves from the scandal. Our neighbors stopped waving when they saw us in the yard. Even our mailman seemed to avoid eye contact when he delivered the daily stack of legal documents and demand letters. I was radioactive, and everyone who had ever known me was scrambling to get as far away as possible before they were contaminated by association. The isolation was almost worse than the legal troubles, because it confirmed what I was beginning to suspect about human nature and the fragility of relationships built on reputation and social standing. But the worst betrayal was still to come, and it would arrive in the form of a phone call that would shatter what remained of my faith in friendship and loyalty. 3 weeks after Tom and Steve's visit, I was sitting in my home office, trying to make sense of the financial records that the FBI had returned after their initial investigation. The agents had been professional but skeptical, clearly viewing me as either a criminal or an idiot, neither of which inspired confidence in their commitment to finding the real perpetrators. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I could hear Jennifer answering it from the kitchen. A few moments later, she appeared in my office doorway with a strange expression on her face. "There are some people here to see you," she said. "Tom and Steve and a few others." I followed her to the living room and found myself facing what looked like an intervention. Tom and Steve were there, along with Mike Patterson from the Chamber of Commerce, Lisa Rodriguez from the Business Association, and Jim Walsh, who had been a client of mine for over 10 years. They were all seated in a semicircle, looking like a tribunal preparing to pass judgment. "What's this about?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. Tom stood up, apparently having been elected as the group's spokesperson. "We've been talking, David, and we think it's time for some straight answers. This situation is affecting all of us, and we deserve to know the truth." "I've been telling the truth from the beginning," I replied, remaining standing rather than taking the empty chair they'd obviously positioned for me. "I was conned by Bradley and his associates. I'm as much a victim as anyone else." "Cut the crap, David," Mike interjected, his face flushed with anger. "We've all seen the evidence. You were in on this from the beginning, and now you're trying to play the innocent victim to avoid responsibility." "What evidence?" I demanded. "Show me one piece of proof that I willingly participated in any criminal activity." Lisa opened a folder she'd been holding and pulled out several sheets of paper. "These are copies of emails sent from your business account to various vendors, authorizing payments for services that were never rendered. They're signed with your electronic signature and sent from your IP address." I took the papers from her and scanned them quickly. They were indeed emails that appeared to be from my account, but I'd never seen them before in my life. The language was formal and businesslike, nothing like my usual communication style, and they referenced vendors and services I'd never heard of. "I didn't send these," I said, but even to my own ears, the denial sounded weak. "Then who did?" Jim asked. "Someone broke into your office, used your computer, forged your signature, and sent fraudulent emails without you knowing about it? Come on, David. We're not idiots." "Actually, that's exactly what happened," I replied, though I was beginning to understand how implausible my story sounded. "Bradley and his people had access to my office during our planning meetings. They could have installed keyloggers or copied my login credentials." Steve laughed bitterly. "So now you're a cybercrime victim too? First you were conned by fake in-laws, then you were the victim of identity theft, and now you're claiming to be the target of sophisticated hackers. At what point do you take responsibility for your own actions?" The frustration and anger that had been building inside me for weeks finally boiled over. "You want to know what I take responsibility for? I take responsibility for being stupid enough to trust family. I take responsibility for not doing enough due diligence before getting involved. I take responsibility for being so eager to help that I ignored my own instincts. But I will not take responsibility for crimes I didn't commit just to make you people feel better about abandoning a friend when he needed you most." The room fell silent for a moment, and I could see the shock on their faces. In all the years they'd known me, I'd never raised my voice or lost my temper in their presence. I was the calm, rational accountant who solved problems with spreadsheets and careful analysis, not emotional outbursts. "We're not abandoning you," Tom said finally. "We're trying to help you face reality. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and the longer you maintain this innocent act, the worse it's going to be for everyone involved." "Worse for who?" I asked. "For me or for you? Because it seems to me that you're all more concerned about protecting your own reputations than finding out what really happened." Mike stood up, his face red with anger. "You're damn right we're concerned about our reputations. Some of us referred clients to you, David. Some of us vouched for your character and integrity. And now we look like fools because we trusted a criminal." "I'm not a criminal," I said, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Then prove it," Lisa challenged. "Show us evidence that supports your story. Give us something we can take to the authorities that will clear your name and ours." I looked around the room at these people I'd considered friends, seeing the doubt and suspicion in their eyes. They wanted me to be guilty because it would be easier than admitting they might have misjudged the situation. They wanted a simple explanation that would allow them to distance themselves with clear consciences. "I can't prove a negative," I said quietly. "I can't prove that I didn't do something. That's not how the justice system works." "Maybe not," Jim said, "but it's how the court of public opinion works. And right now, public opinion says you're guilty as sin." Jennifer, who had been standing silently in the doorway throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. "I think you all need to leave now." "Jennifer, we're trying to help," Tom said, his tone softening slightly. "David needs to accept reality and start making amends. The longer he drags this out, the worse it's going to be for both of you." "Get out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying unmistakable authority. "Get out of my house and don't come back." They filed out without another word, leaving Jennifer and me alone with the wreckage of relationships that had taken years to build and minutes to destroy. I sank into my chair, feeling older than my 42 years and more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. "They think I'm guilty," I said, stating the obvious because I couldn't think of anything else to say. "I know," Jennifer replied, sitting down beside me. "But I don't care what they think. I know who you are, and I know you didn't do this." Her words should have been comforting, but they only made me feel worse. Jennifer was standing by me out of loyalty and love, but I could see the strain it was putting on her. She'd lost friends too, people who were avoiding her because of their association with me. Her own family was keeping their distance, unsure of what to believe about the scandal that had engulfed us. "Maybe they're right," I said. "Maybe I should just confess to something and try to make a deal. At least then this nightmare would be over." "Don't you dare," Jennifer said fiercely. "Don't you dare give up now. Bradley did this to us, and somehow, someway, we're going to prove it." But as I looked at the stack of legal documents on the coffee table and thought about the mounting evidence against me, I couldn't share her optimism. Bradley Morrison had played us all perfectly, and he was probably sitting on a beach somewhere laughing about how easy it had been to destroy my life. What I didn't know at the time was that Bradley had made one crucial mistake in his elaborate scheme. A mistake that would eventually unravel everything he'd worked so hard to accomplish. But it would take months to discover that mistake, and by then, the damage to my reputation and relationships would be irreversible. The confrontation with my former friends marked a turning point in my approach to the situation. Up until that moment, I'd been playing defense, trying to prove my innocence, and hoping that the truth would eventually come to light. But their visit made me realize that passive hope wasn't going to be enough. If I wanted to clear my name and get my life back, I was going to have to go on the offensive. That night, I began planning my counterattack. The private investigator I hired came highly recommended by my attorney, though his appearance didn't inspire immediate confidence. Ray Thompson was a former police detective in his 50s who looked like he'd seen too much of the world's ugliness and decided to make a living from it. His office was a cluttered mess of case files and empty coffee cups, but his reputation for getting results was impeccable. "So, you want me to find a guy named Bradley Morrison, who may or may not be married to a woman named Madison Chen, whose parents may or may not own restaurants in the Midwest," Ray summarized after I'd finished explaining the situation. "And you think this whole family might be fake identities created to con you out of $50,000. $53,000, I corrected. And yes, that's exactly what I think happened. Ray leaned back in his chair and studied me with the kind of penetrating stare that probably made criminals confess just to make it stop. "You realize how this sounds, right? You're either the victim of the most elaborate con job I've ever heard of, or you're trying to hire me to create a fake trail of evidence to support your defense." I'm not asking you to create anything, I replied. I'm asking you to find the truth, whatever that might be. The truth usually costs about $200 a day plus expenses, Ray said, and it can take weeks or months to uncover, depending on how deep the rabbit hole goes. Are you prepared for that kind of investment? I thought about the legal bills that were already mounting, the lost income from my destroyed business, and the mortgage payments that were becoming increasingly difficult to make. $200 a day seemed like a fortune under the circumstances, but it also seemed like my only hope of clearing my name. Do it, I said. Ray's investigation began with the basics, verifying the identities of the people involved and tracing their backgrounds. What he found in the first week was both encouraging and terrifying. Bradley Morrison was real enough, but his recent history was full of gaps and inconsistencies that suggested he'd been living under multiple identities for the past several months. Madison Chen, on the other hand, was a complete fabrication. The woman I'd met at dinner was using a stolen identity belonging to a college student in California who had no idea her personal information was being used in a wedding scam. The real Madison Chen was 20 years old, studying computer science at UCLA, and had never been to our city in her life. Richard and Susan Chen were equally fictional. The photos Ray obtained from restaurant industry databases showed completely different people with the same names, none of whom matched the elegant couple who had charmed us at dinner. The entire Chen family had been an elaborate performance designed to lend credibility to Bradley's scheme. Your cousin-in-law is more sophisticated than you gave him credit for, Ray told me during our second meeting. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment scam. He's been planning this for months, maybe longer. The fake identities, the forged documents, the shell companies. This is professional-level fraud. But why target me specifically? I asked. There are plenty of accountants in the city with access to larger amounts of money. Because you were family, Ray explained. You were predisposed to trust him, and your wife would pressure you to help even if you had doubts. Plus, your business was small enough that you handled most of the financial transactions personally, which made it easier for him to manipulate your accounts. The picture that emerged from Ray's investigation was of a carefully orchestrated con game that had been tailored specifically to my weaknesses and circumstances. Bradley had studied my business practices, my relationship with Jennifer, and my personality flaws, then crafted a scheme that would exploit all of them simultaneously. The good news, Ray continued, is that sophisticated frauds like this usually leave paper trails. The bad news is that following those trails takes time and money, and there's no guarantee we'll be able to recover your funds or locate the perpetrators. What about the FBI investigation? I asked. Shouldn't they be pursuing the same leads? Ray's expression darkened. The FBI is convinced you're guilty, David. They're not looking for evidence of your innocence. They're building a case for your prosecution. Everything they find gets filtered through the assumption that you're the criminal, not the victim. That revelation hit me like a physical blow. I'd been cooperating fully with the federal investigation, assuming that their goal was to uncover the truth and bring the real criminals to justice. The idea that they were actively working to build a case against me was almost too much to bear. How long do I have before they file charges? I asked. Hard to say. Could be weeks, could be months, but you should prepare for the possibility that an indictment is coming, regardless of what we uncover in our investigation. I left Ray's office feeling like a condemned man who'd just learned his execution date was still being determined. The walls were closing in from all sides, and my window of opportunity to prove my innocence was shrinking rapidly. Over the next month, Ray's investigation began to bear fruit. He traced the shell companies that had received the fraudulent payments to a network of offshore accounts controlled by a criminal organization that specialized in identity theft and financial fraud. Bradley Morrison, it turned out, was just one member of a larger group that had been operating similar scams across multiple states. The breakthrough came when Ray identified the real woman who had played Madison Chen during our dinner meeting. Her name was Angela Martinez, and she was a professional actress who had been hired through a talent agency to play the role of a wealthy bride-to-be. She had no idea that the film project she thought she was auditioning for was actually part of an elaborate criminal scheme. Angela agreed to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Her testimony provided crucial evidence that the entire Chen family had been fictional characters created specifically to con me into participating in their money laundering operation. But even with this evidence, the FBI remained skeptical of my innocence. The lead investigator, Special Agent Patricia Williams, seemed convinced that I was either a willing participant in the scheme or the mastermind behind it. My cooperation with their investigation was interpreted as an attempt to misdirect their attention rather than genuine efforts to help. "The problem is that you benefited from the fraud," Agent Williams explained during one of our interviews. "Your business accounts show deposits that correspond to the missing client funds. From our perspective, you were laundering money through fake wedding vendors and then claiming to be a victim when the scheme was exposed. Those deposits were reimbursements for legitimate wedding expenses," I protested. "I have receipts and invoices to prove every transaction." "Receipts and invoices that were created by the same people who set up the shell companies," she replied. "We have no way to verify that any of those expenses were legitimate." It was a perfect catch-22. The evidence that proved my innocence could also be interpreted as proof of my guilt, depending on your assumptions about my involvement. The FBI had decided I was guilty, so every piece of evidence was viewed through that lens. Meanwhile, the civil lawsuits from my former clients were piling up. Even if I could prove my innocence in criminal court, I was still liable for the missing funds under the terms of my professional insurance policy. My business was effectively destroyed, my personal assets were frozen pending the outcome of the investigations, and my reputation in the community was beyond repair. Jennifer and I were living on her teacher's salary and rapidly depleting our savings to pay legal bills. The stress was taking a visible toll on both of us, and I could see cracks beginning to form in our marriage under the pressure of the ongoing crisis. But the worst was yet to come. Ray's investigation had uncovered evidence that Bradley and his associates were still operating in the area, running similar cons on other victims. The realization that they were continuing to destroy lives while I took the blame for their crimes filled me with a rage that I'd never experienced before. That's when I decided that proving my innocence wasn't enough. I wanted revenge. The plan came to me during one of my sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling while Jennifer tossed and turned beside me. Ray's investigation had revealed that Bradley and his crew were still in the area, operating under new identities and targeting other small business owners with variations of the same wedding scam. They felt safe because I was taking the heat for their previous crimes, and law enforcement was focused on building a case against me rather than pursuing the real criminals. But I had advantages that their other victims didn't have. I knew how their operation worked, I had detailed information about their methods and associates, and most importantly, I had nothing left to lose. My business was destroyed, my reputation was ruined, and I was facing potential prison time for crimes I didn't commit. The only question was whether I would go down fighting or simply accept defeat. Ray was initially reluctant to help with what he called my vigilante fantasies, but his attitude changed when we learned that Bradley's crew had successfully conned another local businessman out of nearly $100,000 using an almost identical wedding planning scheme. The victim, a restaurant owner named Frank Castellano, had committed suicide rather than face the shame and financial ruin that followed the discovery of the missing funds. "This has to stop," Ray said during our meeting the day after Frank's funeral. "The FBI is so focused on prosecuting you that they're ignoring an ongoing criminal enterprise that's destroying people's lives." "So what do we do about it?" I asked, though I already had some ideas of my own. "We gather enough evidence to force law enforcement to take action," Ray replied. "We document their current operations, identify their targets, and present a case so compelling that even the FBI can't ignore it. What Ray was proposing was legal and ethical, but it wasn't enough for me anymore. I wanted Bradley Morrison and his associates to pay for what they'd done to Frank Castellano, to me, and to all their other victims. I wanted them to experience the same fear and desperation that I'd been living with for months. I began conducting my own surveillance of Bradley's operation, following leads that Ray had developed and conducting reconnaissance on locations where they were known to operate. It didn't take long to identify their current base of operations, a rented house in an upscale neighborhood where they maintained their collection of fake identities and coordinated their various scams. The house was occupied by 5 people: Bradley, the woman who had played Madison Chen, and 3 other associates who specialized in different aspects of their criminal enterprise. They lived like a family, sharing meals and responsibilities while systematically destroying the lives of innocent people for profit. I watched them for weeks, learning their routines and identifying their vulnerabilities. They were confident to the point of arrogance, convinced that their sophisticated methods and my legal troubles made them untouchable. They had no idea that their primary victim was watching them, learning their secrets, and planning their downfall. The opportunity I'd been waiting for came on a Thursday evening in late November. Bradley and 2 of his associates left the house for what appeared to be a business meeting, leaving only the fake Madison and 1 other person behind. I knew from my surveillance that they typically stayed out for several hours during these evening meetings, which would give me enough time to execute my plan. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering the equipment and materials I would need. Everything was legal to purchase and own, but their intended use was definitely outside the boundaries of lawful behavior. I was crossing a line that I could never uncross, but I was past the point of caring about legal niceties. The security system at the house was sophisticated, but not impenetrable. Ray's police background had taught him about electronic surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques, and he'd shared enough knowledge for me to understand how to defeat basic alarm systems. It took me 20 minutes to gain entry through a basement window, and another 10 minutes to disable the internal motion detectors. The house was a fascinating glimpse into the world of professional fraud. Every room contained evidence of their various scams: fake identification documents, forged business licenses, computer equipment for creating false websites and email accounts, and detailed files on dozens of potential victims. They were running multiple cons simultaneously, targeting everyone from small business owners to elderly retirees, with sophisticated schemes tailored to each victim's specific vulnerabilities. I found my own file in Bradley's desk drawer, containing photographs of my house and office, copies of my business documents, and detailed notes about my personality and relationships. They'd been studying me for months before making their approach, learning everything they could about my weaknesses and motivations. The level of premeditation was staggering, but the most damning evidence was a ledger that documented all of their successful scams over the past 2 years. Frank Castellano's name was there, along with the notation, "Suicide, heat level high," next to the $100,000 payout. My name was listed with a $53,000 total, and the comment, "Fall Guy, investigation redirected." They'd planned from the beginning to frame me for their crimes. I wasn't just a victim of their scam. I was an integral part of their strategy for avoiding prosecution. The rage that filled me as I read through their files was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. These people had destroyed my life as casually as someone might swat a fly, and they were planning to do the same thing to dozens of other innocent victims. I photographed everything I could find, creating a comprehensive record of their criminal enterprise that would be impossible for law enforcement to ignore. But documentation wasn't enough for me anymore. I wanted them to feel the same fear and helplessness that their victims had experienced. The plan I implemented was elegant in its simplicity. Using their own computer equipment, I sent anonymous tips to the IRS, FBI, and local police departments, providing detailed information about their criminal activities and current location. I also sent copies of their victim files to investigative reporters at 3 different newspapers, along with evidence of law enforcement's failure to pursue the real criminals while focusing on prosecuting innocent victims. But my masterpiece was the surprise I left for Bradley personally. Using his own equipment and accounts, I transferred all of the money from their various shell companies and offshore accounts to a victim compensation fund that I established with the help of an attorney who specialized in white-collar crime recovery. The transfers were structured to look like they'd been authorized by Bradley himself, complete with digital signatures and authentication codes that I'd obtained from his personal computer. By the time Bradley and his associates returned from their meeting, they'd lost everything. Their money was gone, their operation was exposed, and law enforcement agencies were converging on their location from multiple directions. The carefully constructed criminal enterprise that had taken them years to build was collapsing around them in a matter of hours. I was watching from across the street when the FBI raid began. The look of shock and terror on Bradley's face as he was dragged out of the house in handcuffs was the most satisfying sight I'd ever witnessed. For the first time in months, I felt like justice was actually being served. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence of their crimes and the prospect of lengthy federal prison sentences, Bradley and his associates agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for reduced sentences. Their testimony provided crucial evidence that cleared my name and led to the recovery of most of the stolen funds. The media coverage was extensive and largely favorable to me, portraying me as a victim who had refused to accept injustice and had worked tirelessly to expose the real criminals. The FBI agents who had been so convinced of my guilt were forced to publicly acknowledge their mistakes and apologize for their tunnel vision approach to the investigation. My former friends and clients, the same people who had abandoned me during my darkest hours, suddenly wanted to rebuild their relationships with me. Tom Harrison called to congratulate me on my vindication and suggested we get together for drinks. Steve Martinez sent a letter apologizing for his lack of faith and offering to help me restart my business. Mike Patterson nominated me for a Community Service Award from the Chamber of Commerce. But their attempts at reconciliation fell on deaf ears. I had learned too much about human nature and the fragility of friendship to ever trust them again. They had shown their true colors when I needed them most, and no amount of apologizing could change that fundamental betrayal. Jennifer and I used the recovered funds to pay off our legal bills and rebuild our financial security. I started a new accounting practice that specialized in helping victims of financial fraud, using my hard-earned expertise to protect others from the kind of sophisticated scams that had nearly destroyed my life. Bradley Morrison was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. His associates received similar sentences, and their criminal enterprise was permanently dismantled. Frank Castellano's family received full restitution for their losses, though no amount of money could bring back the man who had died because of their crimes. As I sat in the courtroom during Bradley's sentencing hearing, listening to the judge describe the devastating impact of his crimes on innocent victims, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began. Justice had been served, not through the normal channels of law enforcement, but through my own determination to fight back against the people who had tried to destroy my life. The judge's final words to Bradley were particularly satisfying. "Mr. Morrison, you and your associates targeted innocent people with sophisticated schemes designed to destroy their lives and reputations. You showed no mercy to your victims, and you will receive none from this court." Bradley looked back at me as he was led away in shackles, his eyes filled with the same fear and desperation that I had lived with for so many months. For the first time since this ordeal began, I smiled with genuine happiness. The man who had tried to make me the fall guy for his crimes was finally facing the consequences of his actions. The friends who had abandoned me when I needed them most were learning that loyalty and character couldn't be rebuilt with simple apologies. The law enforcement agents who had been so eager to prosecute an innocent man were being forced to acknowledge their professional failures in front of the entire community. And I was finally free to rebuild my life on my own terms, stronger and wiser than I had been before Bradley Morrison tried to destroy me. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't just getting even. It's proving that you're better than the people who tried to bring you down. As I walked out of the courthouse with Jennifer by my side, I realized that Bradley had actually done me a favor. His betrayal had shown me who my real friends were, taught me lessons about resilience and determination that I never could have learned otherwise, and given me a new purpose in life helping other victims of financial crimes. The last laugh, it turned out, was mine after all.